Hi, let's talk about the uterus, the ovaries, and the fallopian tubes in this lecture. So, most of this you should be familiar with, although there's a fair amount that we're not going to discuss. But it does show the ovaries and the fallopian tubes, and different parts of the fallopian tube you should be familiar with. There are the fimbriae, which are the tiny little fingers that around ovulation become activated, and they start to become active, and when the egg is ovulated and ejected out into the abdominal pelvic cavity, it needs to be picked up and swept into the opening of the fallopian tube, which is the infundibulum. And then there's cilia and smooth muscle contractions that propel the egg along the fallopian tube. The different parts, I'm not necessarily going to ask you to remember the infundibulum, the ampulla, and the isthmus, which is just a narrow part where it then opens up into the lumen of the uterus, which is where the ovum pops out, and then it has to implant in the endometrium. So this figure is showing on the uterus the endometrium, which is sort of the functional lining, which is shed and regrown each month during the reproductive years of the woman. And then there's also the myometrium, which is just simply the smooth muscle. The cervix you should be aware of, which is the opening into the uterus, vagina. So sperm have to travel through the opening in the cervix, get through that, and then work their way up through the body of the uterus into the fallopian tubes, and we'll talk a little bit more in a subsequent slide on fertilization. So there are a couple of ligaments, only one of which I think you should probably pay attention to. I mean, there is this broad ligament that attaches the entire structure to the abdominal pelvic cavity. But the suspensory ligament is the main ligament for support of the ovary, and it also is associated with the gonadal artery and vein. So I'll just put gonadal A and V for artery and vein. Access the ovary through that, along with that suspensory ligament. And I believe that's about it for that figure. Again, look at the learning objectives that are a separate document for the different structures that I would like you to be able to identify if I gave you a picture such as this. It's those structures that are on the learning objectives that I would ask you to identify in this picture. Of course, the pictures have much more detail than I will ask you to identify. Okay, the next slide. Now we are looking at follicles, different stages of egg development within the ovary. So these are follicular stages. Follicle stages of development. So shortly we will look at both the ovarian cycle, which includes the follicles, and we'll look at the uterine cycle, which includes growth and regeneration of the endometrium. So a couple of things on this figure. They are not necessarily drawn to scale, but here are the primordial follicles. If that's too small to read, I'll write it again. Primordial follicles. And these are the ones that form inside the woman's ovaries female ovaries while she is still in utero developing within her mother. So for the women in the class, your primordial follicles formed in your ovaries when you were inside your mother, about 5 months gestation. So they, let's say they form in utero, in the uterus of your mother. So they form in utero approximately at 5 months gestation or post-fertilization. Has some interesting implications for prenatal health, which we may talk about. And these primordial follicles have started down the road of meiosis, and they have become arrested in prophase 1. So you remember from Biology 160 perhaps that recombination has already occurred, crossing over I should say, has already occurred. They are still diploid. You're getting ready to go through reduction, but at this point as a primordial follicle they're still diploid and they're just sitting there. They hang out until they may wake up during reproductive years and may become fertilized. So they have been in the woman's body since she was 5 months of fetal development inside mom. So essentially, these are going to, if they become fertilized, would develop into your child. So essentially, they are the grandchildren of your mom, which is kind of interesting to think about. So right now, the women in the class are carrying the eggs that could become your mother's grandchildren. Again, implications for prenatal health. Well, as these follicles develop, FSH and LH that we'll look at soon arrive and begin to stimulate the ovaries, begin to stimulate some of these follicles to begin development. So let's just say FSH and LH arrive, not LA, LH. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So they arrive, and you remember where they're coming from? From the anterior pituitary, which I'll abbreviate as the ant bit. And they stimulate and wake up a number of follicles, primordial follicles, to begin development. So I'll abbreviate stimulate. Stimulate, let's say several, maybe half a dozen. Number's not important. Several, but more than one. Several primordial follicles. Essentially to wake up and begin development. I'll abbreviate development. Okay. So the follicle wakes up, and a couple of things that happen, there are a couple of things that you should note. There is a basal lamina. I'm not going to really talk about it much, but it is around the primordial follicle. It's the red band in this picture, and it stays with us all the way through. But more importantly, a couple of things develop with the primary follicle. So we went from primordial to primary. So it's just started to wake up. It's begun development. And the Zona Pellucida forms. Again, if you can't read that in this diagram, you may need to enlarge it. but this is the zona, sometimes just referred to as the zona. Technically, it's the Zona Pellucida. It's a non-cellular membrane that the sperm has to dig its way through to get to the egg, the membrane, the ovum inside the follicle. So the cell membrane is right along here. This is the plasma membrane of the oocyte, of the egg, and it's deep to the Zona Pellucida. So the green is the cell membrane. That's our plasma membrane, and I'll abbreviate membrane. Cell membrane of egg or ovum. Sperm has to bind with that also. There's an interesting reaction that occurs. But at any rate, this is the primary follicle. And something else to note is that we now have a layer of granulosa cells, single layer of cells, so I'll just refer to these as the granulosa cells. And those granulosa cells are sometimes referred to as follicular cells. And they will, as the follicle develops, you'll have more than one layer. It becomes stratified. And they produce estrogen. So these granulosa cells, or these follicular cells, same thing, they begin to produce estrogen. So when we get to the hormonal regulation of this business, you'll need to remember that, where the estrogen is coming from. The secondary follicle also produces estrogen. So now after the follicle continues to develop, the granulosa cells become stratified. There's many more of them. There's still the granulosa cells. I don't need to write that, it's written at the bottom. Stratified granulosa cells. But they also are still producing estrogen. So the follicle continues to produce estrogen. Let's say, and other hormones. We'll say other regulatory hormones, which we'll come to shortly in the next lecture. Other regulatory hormones. Okay. Maybe some notes here. When we're talking about a follicle, for definitions, I suppose. If we're talking about a follicle, it's simply an egg with the surrounding cells. The egg, or the ovum, or the oocyte, however you want to describe it, plus surrounding cells makes up a follicle. And this is within the ovary. So before ovulation. shorthand abbreviation for within ovary. So I'll say prior to ovulation. Once the egg has been ovulated, we don't refer to it as a follicle anymore. Oh, and another note, so if that's one note, second note, antrum. Antral is referring to an antrum, which is so let's say refers to, spelling looks weird there, refers to a antrum, and an antrum is a fluid-filled cavity or space. Fluid-filled cavity. So this slide shows the follicles as being preantral. So that's what's written here. It's a preantral follicle. So there is no antrum shown during a secondary, in the stage of a secondary follicle. So the next slide will show an antral follicle where an antrum has formed. But the primary follicle and the secondary follicle are preantral, meaning they have not yet developed a fluid-filled cavity, a fluid-filled antrum. So that's probably enough of that slide. And so we're leaving this slide with a secondary follicle, which is preantral. And the next slide shows a tertiary follicle, which now has an antrum. So here is the antrum. The follicle has become much larger. The follicular cells have increased and the whole follicle has become larger and is getting closer to ovulation. So once an antrum is formed, it's then referred to as a tertiary follicle. Tertiary, or sometimes just referred to as an antral follicle. And this tertiary or antral follicle will continue to develop, enlarge, and mature, and it will develop into a Graafian follicle. Or a late tertiary. I've seen Graafian follicles also described as quaternary, or the next level from tertiary. So we'll just refer to it as the Graafian follicle. And it's just getting close to ovulation. The Graafian follicle then will ovulate. It will rupture. It moves to the surface of the ovary, forms a blister-like appearance, and will then rupture, and then we have ovulation. And what exits the ovary is the egg and the surrounding granulosa cells. Ovulation of egg and the surrounding granulosa cells. So back to the diagram for a moment. If you just sort of follow along with the numbers and the key at the bottom, this figure actually came from the link that I included in the learning objectives for this unit. So there's a link that takes you to a document where this slide came from and shows the different stages of follicular development, and the discussion is pretty good. So you can just follow along with this key. You may have to enlarge it on your computer in order to see it more clearly. So here are the granulosa cells, which is this one, number 3. Remember what they are producing? You need to remember that. So those are the granulosa cells. And after, well, let's just, okay, since I mentioned it, produce estrogen. After ovulation, they will continue to produce estrogen and progesterone, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. So the surrounding cells, these follicular cells around the follicle, when these are released, those surrounding cells form the corona radiata. Okay. So, let's see, what else did I want to say about this slide? Let's talk about these granulosa cells a little bit more. So this forms the follicle. So after ovulation, those granulosa cells will become the corpus luteum. So let's just say after ovulation, follicle, what's left of it, follicle becomes corpus luteum. Once the egg leaves, what's left behind, the follicle, is now referred to as the corpus luteum, the white body. We'll talk about this more when we get to the hormonal regulation, but I'm just introducing it now, so the next time you come across it, it won't be, not all of it will be new. But the corpus luteum, again, after ovulation, then produces both estrogen and progesterone. So produces estrogen, continues to. It's been producing it all along. And now the corpus luteum also produces progesterone. So you need to remember where the estrogen and the progesterone are coming from. They're coming from those follicular cells, those granulosa cells. Okay, we will come back to that, so don't panic. Let's move on. The last slide for this short lecture, again showing the ovary, top left, and spend a little bit of time just familiarizing yourself with it. Have the primordial follicles, and then we have primary, preantral follicles, so you know what that means. They're follicles that are early on. And now in this figure, notice that the title is, it's an early antral follicle, and the blue is the antrum. It's just starting to form. I should be using the blue ink. So the blue equals the antrum. It's just started to form. So we know that once the antrum begins to form, we're now looking at a tertiary follicle. Okay, what else do we have here? Here's the egg that has been ovulated. With the egg is yellow in the center, and the surrounding pink cells are the corona radiata. So that's shown in greater detail, bottom left, and you should familiarize yourself with what's in the diagram. There's the Zona Pellucida. You don't remember where the cell membrane of the egg would be? The purple nucleus also shows the nucleus and the cytoplasm. So the cell membrane, I didn't mean to be drawing it that dark, is on the outer edge. I'm drawing it in green, just deep to the Zona Pellucida. So that's the plasma membrane. And again, the corona radiata, the surrounding cells, all of that is what's ovulated, and that then needs to be swept up inside into the fallopian tubes. So again, the fimbriae become active, and then the egg is swept into the lumen of the tubule, where it is then fertilized by sperm. So there's a little sperm, there's the egg, and that's where fertilization occurs, is within the fallopian tube. And it generally happens within 1 to 2 days after ovulation. It's longer than that, things don't work. It has to occur fairly early, fertilization, but it does occur in the tube, and then it starts to, the cell, once it's fertilized, begins to divide. So there's the zygote. Now have a 2-cell stage. 2 cells, a couple days later we have 4 cells, etc. And then we have 8 cells. If we had more time, we could talk about the 8-cell stage. There's some interesting features of those 8 cells at that point. If the fertilized embryo, which is what we're looking at, this is very early embryonic development, if that embryo becomes stuck in the fallopian tube and doesn't exit, so let's make a little note here. So if embryo gets stuck gets stuck in tube, then we have a tubal or ectopic pregnancy. And that generally causes destruction of that fallopian tube. Ectopic just means, that's not how you spell ectopic, it's with a C. Ectopic means displaced. You have an ectopic pacemaker. It's not the SA node. It's another piece of tissue that's setting the heart rate. So at any rate, this would be a tubal or ectopic pregnancy. It swells, generally causes rupture of the tube or scarring of the tube, and then that side is lost, and fertility is reduced by half. The other thing to note that I'll come back again and talk about is that early stages, after this 8-cell stage, we still wind up with a solid ball of cells early on, and this is the morula. Again, it's an early stage of embryonic development. So the morula equals a solid ball of cells. Solid ball of cells. It needs to get out of the fallopian tube again. As the embryo develops, it progresses from the morula to a blastocyst. And the blastocyst has a fluid-filled space that also starts to form. And we're going to talk about this also in a subsequent lecture. So the blastocyst now equals a hollow ball of cells. So we'll talk about the blastocyst more later, but it has to exit the fallopian tube in approximately a week, 6 days or so, kind of the outside time frame, where it then has to implant into the endometrium. And then it begins to grow and develop. It burrows in deep into the endometrium, and development continues. So that's enough of these slides in this lecture. The next lecture will do the hormonal regulation, assuming no pregnancy, and we'll end with differences in hormonal regulation with pregnancy. So, see you soon.